A giant cowboy paid $2 for a pregnant, obese teen. But what he did next left the whole town stunned. In a dusty street where men mocked her and church bells tolled, he stepped forward not to own her, but to protect her. Folks thought he'd lost his mind until whisper spread of a powerful railroad family desperate to hide a dangerous secret behind cabin lamplight and the sheriff's rattling keys. A storm was brewing because the girl carried more than just a child. She carried the truth that could bring the county's most feared man to his knees. But with deputies riding hard and law twisted by money, will the cowboys' shocking plan save her or destroy them both? And when mercy costs more than bullets, who will dare stand for what's right? Your reactions remind me why these stories matter. If you still believe in the quiet power of love, justice, and truth, then you're part of the reason I keep sharing them. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Dry Creek's Main Street, baking the packed dirt and raising wisps of dust with every shuffling step. The townsfolk had gathered in an unruly circle, their faces a mix of cruel amusement and uncomfortable silence as they watched the spectacle before them. In the center stood Mary Ellen Thompson, her round frame trembling despite the heat. Tears tracked silently down her cheeks as her uncle yanked on the rope halter he'd fashioned around her neck, as if she were no more than a stubborn mule. Her threadbare dress couldn't hide her swollen belly, evidence of the shame that had brought her to this moment. "Come on now, who'll take this useless stock off my hands?" her uncle called out, his voice thick with whiskey and spite. "Can't feed her no more, and she ain't good for nothing but eating." The crowd tittered, few men tossing copper pennies that landed in the dust at Mary Ellen's feet. The Reverend Matthews stood at the edge of the crowd, his lined face twisted with worry. His hands worked nervously at the worn Bible he clutched. "Now, see here, Brother Thompson," he began, but his weak protest was drowned out by another round of jeers. 2 cents. Someone shouted, "It might be worth a nickel if she wasn't in the family way." Another voice called, drawing cruel laughter. "Mary?" Ellen's shoulders hunched further, trying to make herself smaller despite her size. Her uncle jerked the rope again, making her stumble forward. "Show some spirit, girl. Maybe someone will take pity if you don't look so pathetic." The crowd's attention shifted suddenly as a shadow fell across their circle. Caleb Boone stood there, his massive frame blocking the sun. The laughter died in throats as people stepped back, giving the giant cowboy a wider berth. His weathered face was unreadable, but his eyes held a dangerous gleam as they fixed on Thompson. The uncle's bravado wavered for a moment before he forced a grin. "Well, if it ain't the mountain man himself. Come to join our little auction, Boone." Caleb's voice was low but carried clearly in the sudden quiet. $2 silver. He held up the coins, letting them catch the sunlight. The crowd murmured in shock. It was far more than anyone had expected, this cruel mockery of a sale to bring. Thompson's eyes widened at the sight of real silver. He licked his lips, glancing between the coins and his niece. "Now hold on. Maybe." "I ought to wait for a better $2, Caleb repeated, his tone leaving no room for bargaining. "Take it or leave it." The uncle snatched the coins before anyone could object. He thrust the rope into Caleb's massive hand with a smirk. "She's your problem now, Boone. Hope you got plenty of feed stored up." A few nervous chuckles rose from the crowd, but died quickly under Caleb's stern gaze. Mary Ellen stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the ground, waiting for whatever fresh cruelty might come. Instead, she felt gentle hands removing the rope from her neck. She flinched at the touch. But Caleb's movements remained slow and careful. "No one owns you?" he said quietly, letting the rope fall to the dust. "Not him, not me, not anyone. You're a child of God, same as any here." She dared to look up then, meeting his eyes for the first time. Where she expected to find mockery, or, worse, She saw only kindness in their depths. It was almost more than she could bear after so many months of scorn. The townsfolk watched in uneasy silence as Caleb turned toward his horse. A massive bay stallion that matched its owner's impressive size. "Come along," he said to Mary Ellen, his voice still gentle. "My place is a fair piece up in the Highlands, but we'll take it slow." Whispers followed them down the street. What's he thinking? Taking in damaged goods. That Boone's always been. Strange, living up there alone, reckon he's gone soft in the head since losing his Sarah. Mary Ellen followed Caleb, her steps uncertain but steady. Each step took her further from the uncle who had made her life a misery since her parents. Death from the townspeople who had watched her suffering with indifference or cruel entertainment. She didn't know what waited at the end of this path, but it had to be better than what she was leaving behind. Caleb helped her mount his horse with surprising gentleness, making sure she was secure before taking the reins to lead them on foot. The last rays of sun painted the street in gold as they left Dry Creek behind. The crowd already dispersing now that their afternoon's entertainment was over. The Reverend Matthews watched them go, his weathered face thoughtful. He'd known Caleb Boone for years, seen him weather the loss of his wife and unborn child with quiet dignity. Now, watching the giant cowboy lead his horse with such care, the preacher offered up a silent prayer for both of them, the broken man and the lost girl, each carrying wounds that only mercy might heal, as they passed the last buildings of Dry Creek. Mary Ellen sat straight in the saddle, despite her fear and exhaustion. For the first time in months, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her heart. It took her a moment to recognize it for what it was: hope. The sun sank behind the distant mountains as Caleb led them toward the highland country he called home. Neither spoke. There would be time enough for words later. For now, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats marked their progress away from cruelty and toward whatever grace tomorrow might bring. The evening sun painted long shadows across the sagebrush. As Caleb led his horse and rider to where his wagon waited at the edge of town, the old vehicle sat hitched to a pair of steady draft horses, supplies already loaded for the journey home. Mary Ellen perched uncertainly on Caleb's bay stallion, her hands gripping the saddle horn as if it were the only solid thing in her world. Caleb cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. "Ma'am, if you'll allow me, I'll help you down and get you settled in the wagon. It'll be more comfortable for the ride home." Mary Ellen flinched at his voice, but gave a tiny nod. When his massive hands reached up to assist her, she squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for rough handling. Instead, his touch was careful, almost feather-light, as he lifted her down. Her feet had barely touched the ground before she shuffled back, keeping distance between them. "There's blankets in the back," Caleb said, gesturing to the wagon bed. "Make yourself comfortable as you can." He tied his stallion to the back of the wagon, then climbed up to take the reins. The wagon creaked as they started moving, wheels cutting familiar tracks into the dusty road. Around them, the hills rolled away in waves of silver-green sage, touched with gold by the setting sun. As daylight faded, crickets began their evening chorus, filling the silence between driver and passenger. Mary Ellen huddled in the wagon bed, watching Caleb's broad back. Her mind raced with terrible possibilities of what awaited her. Would she be worked until she collapsed, treated like the animal her uncle had named her? The baby in her womb kicked, as if sensing her distress, and she placed a protective hand over the swell of her belly. They had traveled perhaps a mile when Caleb's deep voice broke the cricket song. "Miss Thompson," he said, keeping his eyes on the road ahead, "I reckon you're wondering what's to become of you." She didn't answer, but he continued anyway, his words measured and clear. "I want you to know plain, you'll not be my servant nor my wife. My plan is simple: to see you safe, bring your child into this world with dignity. Nothing more. The wagon wheels turned several times before Mary Ellen found her voice, barely a whisper in the gathering dusk. But no man's ever spoken kind to me before. Her words caught on a sob she tried to swallow back. Caleb's shoulders tensed, but his voice remained gentle. Well, that ain't right. Ain't right at all. They rode on as evening deepened into true night. Caleb lit a lantern that swayed from the wagon seat, casting pools of warm light on the trail. Ahead, the road wound higher into the hills through stands of pine that whispered in the night wind. Finally, they crested a rise, and Caleb's cabin came into view. It was a solid structure of squared logs with a stone chimney reaching up toward the star-filled sky. A barn stood off to one side, and a small vegetable garden was visible in the lantern light. Caleb helped Mary Ellen down from the wagon with the same gentle care he'd shown before. She stood uncertainly as he unlocked the cabin door and lit the lamps inside. The interior was simple but clean. A stone fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, shelves lined with books and provisions. "Fire's laid ready," Caleb said, striking a match to the kindling. "Won't take but a minute to warm up." He moved to the kitchen area, gathering items from the shelves. Soon, the smell of coffee filled the cabin, and he set out a loaf of bread and a pot of beans he'd warmed on the stove. "Eat what you like," he told her, gesturing to the table. "Spare rooms through that door. Clean sheets on the bed, and there's a lock on the inside of the door. Use it if it helps you rest easier." Mary Ellen stared at him, then at the food, her hands twisting in her worn dress. I don't understand," she whispered. "Nothing to understand," Caleb replied. "You need help, I can give it. That's all." He picked up his coffee cup and moved toward the door. "I'll be sitting out front if you need anything. Good night, Miss Thompson." Alone in the cabin, Mary Ellen sank into a chair. The bread was fresh, the beans still warm. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, though tears fell freely down her cheeks. When she could eat no more, she crept to the spare room, closing and locking the door as Caleb had suggested. The bed was soft, the blankets clean and warm. In the quiet darkness, Mary Ellen curled around her swollen belly and wept. Not from fear or pain this time, but from the shocking possibility that she might actually be safe. Outside, Caleb sat in his rocking chair on the porch, nursing his coffee gone cold. The night wind carried the sound of coyotes calling in the distance, but his thoughts were on the girl in his spare room. "Lord," he prayed softly, his deep voice barely more than a whisper, "give me strength to protect her. Show me how to shield her from this world's cruelty." He fell silent then, rocking slowly, standing guard as the stars wheeled overhead. Dawn crept over the Colorado highlands, bringing with it a biting chill that frosted the cabin windows. Mary Ellen woke to unfamiliar silence, no shouts, no cruel laughter, just the soft whisper of wind through pine boughs. She lay still for several moments, remembering where she was, before gathering courage to unlock the bedroom door. The main room stood empty, though a low fire crackled in the hearth. Through the window, she could see Caleb's broad figure moving between the barn and the corral, caring for his horses. His movements were steady and sure, each task performed with careful attention. Mary Ellen's stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since the previous night. She looked around the cabin's main room, taking in details she'd missed in the darkness, worn but clean curtains at the windows. A shelf of books beside the fireplace, a patchwork quilt draped over the rocking chair. Everything spoke of simple comfort, so different from the chaos she'd known. The door creaked open. Caleb stepped in, stamping snow from his boots. "Morning, Miss Thompson," he said quietly. "Hope you slept well." She nodded, shrinking slightly against the wall. "Yes, sir. Thank you." "No need for sir," he replied. "Caleb will do fine." He moved to the iron stove, adding wood from a nearby Box. You'll want to keep close to this on cold mornings. Takes a while to warm the whole cabin. Mary Ellen edged closer to the stove, holding her hands out to the growing warmth. Caleb watched her for a moment, then said, "Best show you the well, so you can draw water when you need it." He led her outside, where frost sparkled on every surface. The well stood a short distance from the cabin, its wooden frame solid against the morning sky. Caleb demonstrated the windlass, showing her how to lower and raise the bucket. "Rope's new and strong," he explained. "Won't give you trouble. But if you're feeling unsteady," he glanced at her swollen belly, "just ask for help. No shame in that." Back inside, Caleb began gathering items for breakfast: coffee, flour, eggs from the cold box. Mary Ellen watched him work, twisting her apron between her fingers. She started, then faltered. Caleb waited patiently until she found her voice again. "I don't cook very well," she admitted, face flushing. "Uncle never taught me proper. Said I'd just waste good food." A gentle chuckle rumbled from Caleb's chest. "Well now, cooking's just another skill to learn, like any other. Plenty of time for that." He gestured to the stove. "Come here. I'll show you how to start with biscuits. Can't go wrong with those." The morning passed peacefully as Caleb taught Mary Ellen the basics of his kitchen. She dropped flour on the floor and nearly burned the first batch of biscuits. But Caleb never raised his voice or showed impatience. By the time they sat down to eat, she'd managed to produce several golden brown biscuits that were, if not perfect, at least edible. "See there?" Caleb said, spreading honey on one of her biscuits. "Already learning." Mary Ellen felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of fear she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. Maybe here, in this quiet cabin with this gentle giant of a man, she could find. The sharp rap of knuckles on the cabin door shattered her thoughts. Caleb rose slowly, his expression guarded. When he opened the door, the local preacher stood there, his horse stamping in the yard behind him. "Brother Boone," the preacher said, removing his hat, "might I have a word?" Caleb stepped aside, allowing the older man to enter. The preacher's eyes fell immediately on Mary Ellen, who shrank in her chair. "Miss Thompson," he acknowledged with a nod, then turned back to Caleb. "I've come because there's talk in town. The kind of talk that can damage a good man's reputation. Folks always find something to talk about," Caleb replied evenly. The preacher sighed. "This is different, Brother Boone." Taking in he glanced at Mary Ellen again, a young woman in her condition. "People are assuming the worst." Mary Ellen's face burned with shame, made she stared at her hands, folded protectively over her belly, wishing she could disappear. "Let them assume," Caleb said. "Truth stands on its own." "The truth might be worse than assumptions," the preacher pressed. "This situation, it's drawn attention. Dangerous attention? Maybe." A heavy silence filled the cabin. Finally, Mary Ellen spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "He means the railroad man's son." Both men turned to look at her. The preacher's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Joshua Preston," Mary Ellen continued, the words tumbling out like water. "Through a broken dam, he said he loved me. Said we'd marry once his father gave permission. But when I told him about the baby," her voice caught. T laughed. "Said his father would never let him marry someone like me. Then he left on the evening train and never came back." Caleb's face had gone still as stone. Everyone in the territory knew the Preston name, the family that controlled the railroad, and through it, most everything else that mattered. The preacher cleared his throat. "Well, that does complicate matters." "Don't change anything," Caleb said firmly. "She stays." "Brother Boone, the Prestons aren't known for their Christian charity. They think this might become a scandal, then they can come talk to me about it." Caleb's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of mountains behind it. The preacher studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll pray for you both," he said, reaching for his hat. "I suspect you'll need it." After the preacher rode away, silence settled over the cabin again. Mary Ellen remained at the table, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to bring trouble to your door." Caleb turned from the window, where he'd been watching the preacher disappear down the trail. "You've brought no trouble here," he said gently. "The trouble came from men who forgot their duty to God and neighbor." He returned to the table and began clearing the breakfast dishes. "Now, how about we see about making some stew for supper? Might as well keep working on those cooking lessons." Mary Ellen stared at him, wondering at this man who seemed unmoved by the threat of Preston power. As they worked together in the kitchen, she noticed how he positioned himself between her and the door, as if already preparing to protect her from whatever might come. That evening, over bowls of somewhat lumpy but edible stew, Mary Ellen found herself telling Caleb the whole story, how Joshua Preston had courted her in secret, made grand promises, then abandoned her without a backword. Glance how her family had turned her out when they discovered her shame, how she'd ended up at her uncle's mercy. And then the auction block. Caleb listened without interrupting, his face thoughtful in the lamplight. She could see him taking in every detail, measuring the weight of Preston influence against his own resources. But he asked no questions, offered no judgment. He simply listened, letting her words fill the warm kitchen air between them. Dawn painted the sky in pale streaks as Caleb hitched the horses to his wagon. Mary Ellen stood in the doorway of the cabin, wringing her hands in her worn apron. "Are you certain I should come along?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I could stay here." Caleb adjusted the harness before turning to her. "Trading post got what we need. Flour's running low, and we're nearly out of lamp oil." He paused, his expression gentle. "Can't hide forever, Miss Thompson. Best face folks head on." Mary Ellen nodded, though her heart fluttered like a trapped bird. She knew he was right. They needed supplies, and she couldn't spend the rest of her days hiding in the cabin. Still, the thought of facing the townspeople made her stomach churn. The wagon creaked as Caleb helped her up onto the wooden seat. He'd placed a folded blanket there to make it more comfortable, and Mary Ellen felt a wave of gratitude at his thoughtfulness. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and pine as they set off down the winding trail to Wardtown. As they rode, Mary Ellen kept her eyes fixed on her hands, folded in her lap. The bump of her pregnancy seemed more pronounced than ever, and she wished she had a shawl to wrap around herself. Beside her, Caleb handled the reins with quiet confidence, occasionally clicking his tongue to encourage the horses up steeper sections of the trail. The trading post came into view all too soon. Several horses were already hitched outside, their riders visible through the dusty windows. Mary Ellen's throat went dry at the sight of them. "Remember," Caleb said softly as he brought the wagon to a stop, "you've done nothing to be ashamed of. Hold your head up." Inside the trading post, the usual bustle of commerce went silent as they entered. Mary Ellen could feel the weight of hostile stares pressing against her. She instinctively moved closer to Caleb, grateful for his towering presence between her and the other customers. The storekeeper, Mr. Jenkins, stood behind his counter, his face a mask of barely concealed distaste. Caleb approached with his usual measured stride, Mary Ellen keeping close to his shadow. "Need flour and lamp oil," Caleb said, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Coffee, too, if you've got fresh." Jenkins hesitated, his eyes darting. Between Caleb and Mary Ellen, "Ain't sure I got enough flour to spare," he muttered. "Saw 3 full barrels out back when we rode in," Caleb replied evenly. "Reckon that's plenty." A woman near the pickle barrel whispered something to her companion, both of them tittering behind their hands. Mary Ellen felt her face flush hot with shame, but Caleb didn't so much as glance their way. Finally, Jenkins began gathering their supplies, though his movements were grudging. "That'll be $2 even," he said, naming a price well above the usual. Caleb laid the money on the counter without comment, though Mary Ellen noticed his jaw tighten slightly. As he gathered their purchases, she heard more whispers behind. "Them disgrace and fool" among the words that reached her ears. Outside, the bright sunlight did nothing to warm the chill that had settled in Mary Ellen's bones. As Caleb loaded the supplies into the wagon, two ranch hands who'd been lounging against the hitching post straightened up. "Well, if it ain't the charitable Mr. Boone," one called out, touching the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. "Mighty Christian of you, taking in strays." His companion grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Better watch yourself, Boone. That kind of charity's liable to bring a man nothing but ruin." Caleb turned slowly, his massive frame seeming to grow even larger as he faced the ranch hands. He didn't speak, didn't move, just fixed them with a steady stare that seemed to reach right through them. The moments stretched out like pulled taffy until, one by one, the ranch hands dropped their eyes and backed away. The return journey was quiet, hoofbeats and wagon wheels providing a steady rhythm to Mary Ellen's troubled thoughts. Finally, she gathered her courage and spoke. "Mr. Boone." Her voice sounded small, even to her own ears. Do you regret it? Buying me at the auction." Caleb was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said simply, "No. What's right ain't always easy." Those words settled into Mary Ellen's heart like a warm coal, glowing with possibility. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the trail. That evening, Mary Ellen insisted on helping with supper. "I ought to learn proper," she said, determination pushing past her usual timidity. "Can't have you doing all the cooking forever." Caleb showed her how to mix biscuit dough, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he demonstrated the proper technique. Mary Ellen tried her best to copy his movements, though her results were far less certain. When she pulled her first batch from the oven, the biscuits were decidedly brown on the bottom. "Oh," she exclaimed in dismay, "they're burnt." But Caleb simply picked one up, spread it with butter, and took a bite. "Tastes just fine to me," he said, reaching for another. The simple kindness of that gesture, his willingness to eat her burnt biscuits without complaint, struck something loose inside Mary Ellen. A small laugh bubbled up from her chest, surprising her with its unfamiliarity. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed, surely not since before Joshua. Preston had ruined her life. The sound seemed to fill the cabin with warmth, transforming the space. Even Caleb's eyes crinkled at the corners, though he didn't quite smile. "Well," Mary Ellen said, wiping flour from her hands, "I reckon tomorrow's biscuits might turn out better." "Reckon they might," Caleb agreed, finishing his burnt biscuit without a single complaint. The days settled into a gentle rhythm at Caleb's cabin, each sunrise bringing new lessons for Mary Ellen to learn. The morning air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as Caleb showed her how to sort through the basket of torn shirts needing mending. "Thread wants to match the cloth," he explained, his large fingers surprisingly nimble as he demonstrated how to knot the end. "Makes the stitches near invisible when done right." Mary Ellen's first attempts were clumsy, leaving uneven rows that puckered the fabric. But Caleb never criticized, just nodded encouragingly when she got it right. Time and patience, he'd say that's all it takes. During the cooler hours, Caleb taught her about gathering firewood. "Never take from the bottom of a pile," he warned, showing her how to check for snakes or scorpions. "And dead branches burn better than green ones." Mary Ellen learned to listen for the dry snap that meant good kindling, though she still struggled to carry much with her awkward pregnancy. The nervous mare in the barn, a pretty bay named Sugar, became Mary Ellen's special project. At first, the horse would shy away, rolling her eyes at any sudden movement, but Caleb showed Mary Ellen how. To approach slowly, speaking in soft, even tones. Horses can smell fear, he explained, demonstrating how to hold her hand flat with an apple. Show them you're steady, they'll steady too. Day by day, Sugar grew calmer under Mary Ellen's attention. The first time the mare took an apple from her hand without flinching, Mary Ellen felt a surge of pride she hadn't known in months. Then came Sunday morning. Caleb appeared at breakfast wearing his good shirt, recently mended by Mary Ellen's improving stitches. "Best get ready," he said, clearing away the breakfast dishes. "We're heading to church today." Mary Ellen's heart clenched with fear. "Oh no, Mr. Boone, please, I couldn't." She twisted her apron in her hands. "The way folks talk, the things they'll say." Caleb's expression remained gentle but firm. "Can't hide forever, Miss Thompson. Dignity ain't something folks give you, it's something you claim." He paused, then added softly, "The Lord's house should welcome all his children." Though her hands trembled as she dressed in her cleanest dress, Mary Ellen knew he was right. She'd have to face the town eventually. Still, her heart hammered as they approached the white-painted church on the outskirts of Dry Creek. The morning sun cast long shadows across the church steps as wagons and riders arrived. Conversation died away as Caleb helped Mary Ellen down from their wagon. She felt the weight of stairs pressing against her back as they climbed the steps. Inside, the familiar scent of beeswax candles and hymn books filled the air. Mary Ellen kept her eyes fixed on the floor as Caleb led her to a pew near the middle of the church. Whispers rustled like autumn leaves around them. The nerve, in God's house, that poor man. Mary Ellen's cheeks burned. But Caleb sat straight and calm beside her, as unmovable as a mountain. When the preacher called for prayer, heads bowed throughout the congregation. But Caleb stood, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed sanctuary. "Begging your pardon, Reverend," he said, "but I've got something needs saying first." The preacher hesitated, then nodded. Caleb turned to face the congregation, his presence commanding attention. "Some of you know me as a man of few words," he began. "So when I speak, I reckon it's worth hearing." His gaze swept across the pews. "Miss Thompson here is under my protection. Not as servant, not as wife, but as someone deserving Christian charity." Murmurs rippled through the church. Caleb's voice grew stronger. Scripture tells us clear about caring for widows and orphans in their distress, about showing mercy to the vulnerable. His hand rested protectively on the back of their pew. "Anyone got a problem with that can take it up with me direct." Mary Ellen hardly dared breathe as silence fell over the church. Then, from the front pew, old Mrs. Miller nodded firmly. Other women began nodding too, their faces softening as they looked at Mary Ellen with new eyes. The service proceeded, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. When the final hymn ended, several of the older women approached while Caleb spoke. With the preacher, Mrs. Miller pressed a small bundle wrapped in brown paper into Mary Ellen's hands. "Some cloth," she whispered, "for the little one." Before Mary Ellen could respond, Mrs. Peterson added a loaf of fresh bread to her arms. "Still warm," she said, with a kind smile. "Growing babies need good food." Then came Mrs. Jackson, her weathered hands holding something tiny and white. "Made these myself," she said, revealing a pair of delicately knitted baby booties. Every child deserves a proper welcome. Mary Ellen clutched the gifts to her chest, tears spilling down her cheeks. These simple offerings meant more than their practical value. They were acceptance, acknowledgement of her humanity. The women patted her shoulder gently, murmuring words of encouragement. When Caleb returned to her side, he took in the sight of her tear-stained face and armload of gifts with quiet satisfaction. He didn't speak until they were back in the wagon, heading home through the golden afternoon light. "Reckon folks just needed reminding," he said softly, "about what being Christian really means." Mary Ellen looked down at the tiny booties in her lap, touching one with a gentle finger. "Thank you," she whispered, "meaning so much more than just the church." Caleb simply nodded, understanding all she couldn't say. A week of peace shattered like glass on a cold morning in October. Mary Ellen was hanging freshly washed sheets on the line, humming softly to herself when she heard hoofbeats approaching. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their horses kicking up dust along the path to the cabin. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, his shoulders tensing as he assessed the visitors. The man in front wore a tailored black coat that marked him as a city dweller, his silver watch chain glinting in the morning sun. Behind him rode 2 deputies, their tin stars catching the light. Mary Ellen's hands froze on the damp sheet, her heart thundering against her ribs. She recognized the lead rider, Mr. Harrison, the railroad boss's foreman, the same man who had sneered at her tears when she'd begged for help months ago. "That's far enough," Caleb called out as the riders neared the yard. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed. Harrison reined his horse to a stop, looking down his nose at Caleb. "Mr. Boone," he said, his cultured accent dripping with disdain, "I've come about the Thompson girl." Mary Ellen shrank back behind the billowing sheets, one hand protectively covering her swollen belly. She could just make out Caleb's broad frame through the gap between the linens. "Miss Thompson is under my protection," Caleb replied evenly. "State your business and be on your way." Harrison's lip curled. "Protection? Is that what you call harboring this eyesore to respectable society?" He gestured dismissively toward the laundry line where Mary Ellen hid. "The girl needs to be removed, for the good of the community's moral standing." "This is my land," Caleb said, his voice hardening, "and she's here by her own choice. I suggest you ride on." One of the deputies shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, but Harrison's face darkened with anger. "Don't be a fool, Boone. You're involving yourself in matters beyond your station. The railroad has interests to protect, reputations to maintain." "Seems to me," Caleb responded, "that some reputations deserve tarnishing." Harrison's hand tightened on his reins. "This isn't over. Legal proceedings are already in motion. You'll regret choosing this battle." He wheeled his horse around, kicking up dust. Deputies make note of this refusal to cooperate. The 3 riders departed as swiftly as they'd come, leaving behind a heavy silence. Mary Ellen's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the dirt, shaking. Caleb was at her side in an instant, helping her to stand. "It's all right," he murmured, though his eyes remained fixed on the retreating riders. "You're safe here." But Mary Ellen saw the worry in the tight line of his jaw. "They'll come back," she whispered. "They always win. The railroad always wins." Caleb led her inside, setting her in the kitchen chair nearest the stove's warmth. As he brewed a pot of chamomile tea, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, matching their troubled thoughts. The afternoon light was failing when they heard another horse approaching. Mary Ellen startled, spilling drops of tea on her dress, but Caleb recognized the familiar gait of the preacher's old mare. Reverend Gardner's face was grave as he dismounted. Caleb met him on the porch, and Mary Ellen strained to hear their low conversation through the window. "It's worse than we feared," the preacher said, removing his hat. "The railroad boss has filed a legal writ with the county judge. They mean to have Mary Ellen removed to the poorhouse until her confinement." Caleb's massive hands gripped the porch railing. "They can't do that. They can, and they might succeed." The preacher looked older than his years in the fading light. The poorhouse has legal precedent for taking in unmarried mothers. They're claiming it's for her own good, proper medical care and such. A small sound of distress escaped Mary Ellen's throat. She knew about the poorhouse. Everyone did. It was a place of despair where unwanted people were sent to be forgotten, where unwed mothers were worked like slaves and their babies often disappeared. Into orphan trains heading east, the preacher continued, his voice heavy with concern. The railroad boss has influence with the judge. Money speaks louder than justice sometimes. Caleb's jaw tightened until Mary Ellen could see the muscles standing out. The Lord's justice speaks louder than any man's money, he said firmly. True. Enough, the preacher agreed, but we're dealing with earthly courts here. They'll send officers with papers. It could get ugly. Mary Ellen couldn't bear it any longer. She rushed out onto the porch, her eyes wild with fear. Please, she begged, clutching Caleb's arm. Don't let them take me there. I'll die in that place. We both will. Her hand pressed against her belly, where the baby kicked as if sensing her distress. Caleb's large hand covered hers, steady and warm. No one's taking you anywhere, he said, with such quiet conviction that she almost believed him. I gave you my word. You're under my protection. The hearing is set for next week, the preacher said quietly. I'll do what I can to rally support from the congregation, but he trailed off, the weight of the railroad's influence hanging unspoken in the air. After the preacher left, Mary Ellen couldn't stop trembling. She moved through the evening chores like a sleepwalker, jumping at every sound from the woods. Even the familiar creak of the cabin's timbers made her flinch. Caleb watched her with concern as she picked at her supper. Try to eat something, he encouraged. Keep up your strength. I can't, she whispered. Every time I think about that place, fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. The stories people tell about the poorhouse. The women who go in never come out the same. And the babies. She couldn't continue. Look at me, Caleb said, his deep voice gentle but firm. Mary Ellen raised her eyes to meet his steady gaze. I won't let them take you there. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. You have my word. But how can you stop them? She asked. They have the law on their side. And money and power. We have something stronger, he replied. We have truth and mercy. And folks who'll stand with us. He reached across the table to clasp her trembling hand. The Lord didn't lead me to buy you from that auction just to abandon you now. Mary Ellen wanted desperately to believe him, but fear had sunk its claws too deep. She spent that night huddled in her bed, listening to the wind moan through the pines like lost souls. In the main room, she could hear Caleb's heavy footsteps as he paced, standing guard against threats both seen and unseen. The autumn morning dawned cold and gray, 3 days after the preacher's warning. Mary Ellen stood at the kitchen window, kneading bread dough with trembling hands. The familiar motions brought little comfort now. Every hoofbeat on the wind made her heart race. Caleb sat at the table cleaning his rifle, his movements precise but troubled. He'd barely slept these past nights, keeping watch like a shepherd guarding against wolves. The circles under his eyes told of his vigil. The sound they'd been dreading finally came just before noon horses approaching. Not one, but several. Mary Ellen's hands froze in the dough. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, rifle at the ready. Stay. Inside, he ordered quietly, moving to the window. His broad frame tensed as he counted the riders. Sheriff Rourke. 2 deputies. Mary Ellen's legs went weak. She gripped the counter to stay upright, her breath coming in short gasps. Please, she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was, begging Caleb, the Lord, or fate itself. The riders drew up in the yard, dust settling around their horses' hooves. Sheriff Rourke dismounted first, his weathered face grim. He held a rolled paper in one hand, the writ they'd feared. "Caleb," the sheriff called out. "Need to speak with you." Instead of responding, Caleb moved to bar the door, sliding the heavy wooden beam into place. His rifle gleamed dully in the cabin's dim light. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Rourke's voice carried through the wood. "I've got legal papers here. County judge's orders concerning Mary Ellen Thompson." Mary Ellen pressed her hands to her mouth, stifling a sob. The baby kicked inside her, sensing her distress. She watched Caleb's face, saw the muscle working in his jaw as he wrestled with his choice. "You know what they'll do to her in that poorhouse, Tom?" Caleb called back, his voice hard. "You know it ain't right. Ain't about right or wrong anymore." The sheriff answered, "It's about the law. Don't force me to break down this door." Mary Ellen couldn't bear it. The thought of Caleb shooting someone, spilling blood because of her, was too much. She stumbled forward, catching his arm. "Please don't," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't live with myself if you killed someone trying to protect me. Please." Caleb looked down at her, his eyes full of anguish. The rifle trembled slightly in his huge hands. Mary Ellen saw him remembering something distant and painful perhaps, the loss that had carved such deep lines around his eyes. "I made a vow," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "After Sarah, after I lost them both, no more blood. Not ever?" The sheriff's voice came again. "Caleb, what's it going to be?" Mary Ellen squeezed Caleb's arm. "You've shown me more kindness than anyone ever has," she said softly. "Don't let it end in violence, please." For a long moment, Caleb stood frozen, the weight of his choice visible in every line of his body. Then, with a sound like a wounded bear, he lowered the rifle. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving him looking older and more weary than Mary Ellen had ever seen him. He unbarred the door with hands that shook slightly. Sheriff Rourke entered first, relief evident on his face when he saw the rifle laid aside. The deputies followed, hands nervous on their gun belts. "I'm sorry, Caleb," Rourke said quietly, holding out the writ. "I truly am." Caleb didn't take the paper. He turned instead to Mary Ellen, his voice rough with emotion. "I gave you my word. You'd be safe. I failed you." "No," Mary Ellen whispered, her tears falling faster now. "You saved me. You showed me I was worth something, that I deserved dignity." She pressed her hand to her belly. "We both did." The deputies moved forward awkwardly, uncertain how to handle her in her condition. Mary Ellen flinched away from there. Touch, turning instead to cling to Caleb's shirt. For a moment, he enfolded her in his massive arms, as if he could shield her from what was coming. "The wagon's outside," Sheriff Rourke said gently. "Time to go, miss." Mary Ellen's fingers clutched desperately at Caleb's shirt. "I'm scared," she whispered against his chest. "I know," he murmured back. "But you're stronger than you think. Keep praying. Keep believing." His voice broke slightly. "I won't stop. Trying to help you, I swear it." The deputies had to pry her away from him. Mary Ellen sobbed as they led her outside, her steps faltering. They helped her up into the waiting wagon as carefully as they could, but their hands were impersonal, dutiful rather than kind. Caleb followed them out into the yard. He stood like a statue as they arranged blankets around Mary Ellen, his fists clenched at his side so hard the knuckles showed white. The sheriff mounted up, taking the wagon's reins. "I'll make sure she's treated proper," Rourke promised. "You have my word on that." Caleb didn't respond. His eyes were locked on Mary Ellen's tear-streaked face, as if trying to memorize it. She reached out toward him one last time as the wagon began to move. "Thank you," she called out, her voice breaking. "For everything." The wagon rolled away, the deputies riding escort beside it. Caleb stood in the yard long after they disappeared, watching the dust cloud fade into the distance. Only when they were completely gone did his shoulders begin to shake. That night, alone in the cabin that suddenly felt too big and too empty, Caleb fell to his knees beside his bed. The silence pressed in around him, no longer peaceful, but accusatory. No more sounds of Mary Ellen humming as she worked, or her soft footsteps, or her shy laughter that had begun to come more freely with each passing day. Lord, he prayed, his voice raw with emotion, give me wisdom, show me the path. I promised to protect her, and I failed. His massive hands gripped the bed frame. Don't let my weakness cost her everything, please. But only silence answered his desperate prayer. The cabin creaked and settled around him, its familiar sounds now haunting reminders of absence. Where? Mary Ellen's presence had brought warmth and purpose to these rooms. Now there was only the hollow echo of what had been lost. The darkness deepened as Caleb remained on his knees, wrestling with his choices and their consequences. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote wailed a lonely sound that seemed to give voice to the ache in his heart. The county poorhouse loomed before Mary Ellen like a fortress of despair. Its gray stone walls rose 3 stories high, windows barred with iron, more prison than shelter. The wagon's wheels crunched to a halt on gravel, and she clutched her small bundle of belongings closer. Sheriff Rourke helped her down carefully, his kindness ending at the front steps where Matron Griggs waited. The woman's face was as hard as the building stone, her mouth twisted in a permanent sneer. Another one, Matron Griggs said, eyeing Mary Ellen's size with disgust. Well, don't expect special treatment here, girl. We're not a hotel for fallen women. Mary Ellen's cheeks burned as she followed the matron inside. The interior smelled of harsh lye soap and boiled cabbage. Women in faded dresses shuffled through dim hallways, heads down, avoiding eye contact. 3rd floor, Matron Griggs barked, pointing to a narrow staircase. Mind you don't break the steps with your weight. Each stair creaked under Mary Ellen's feet as she climbed, her breath coming hard by the time she reached the top. The dormitory was a long room lined with iron beds, most occupied by women in various stages of pregnancy or illness. End bed, the matron ordered. And here's your ration card. Half portions doctor's orders for your condition. Mary Ellen sank onto the thin straw mattress, fighting tears as the matron's footsteps retreated. Around her, whispers started like angry wasps. Look at the size of her. Probably ate her way right out of proper society. Heard a rancher bought her like cattle. Mary Ellen turned her face to the wall, one hand pressed to her swollen belly. From her bundle, she drew out the tiny knitted booties given by the church women. In the dim light, she traced their delicate stitches with trembling fingers. Lord, she whispered, please don't let my baby be born in this place. Miles away, Caleb Boone's cabin stood silent as a tomb. He moved through his daily tasks like a man sleepwalking, feeding animals, mending fences, cooking meals he barely tasted. The empty chair at his table accused him with every glance. He'd start tasks only to abandon them halfway through, his mind constantly returning to Mary Ellen's tear-stained face as they'd taken her away. The silence pressed in around him until he could hardly breathe. After 3 days of this torment, he saddled his horse and rode to town, seeking out the preacher's house. Reverend Matthews met him on the porch, reading the anguish in Caleb's face. I can't leave her there, Caleb said without preamble. That place will kill her spirit, if not her body. The preacher gestured to a chair. Sit, brother, I hear thee. Anger in your voice. Shouldn't I be angry? It ain't right, what they're doing to her. No, it's not right. Reverend Matthews agreed quietly. But violence won't help her. You need to seek God's will in this, not vengeance. Caleb's massive hands clenched on his knees. Then what am I supposed to do? Just let them break her. Pray, the preacher said simply. And trust that the Lord works in ways we don't always see coming. Those words echoed in Caleb's mind that evening as he sat on his porch watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The crunch of hooves in his yard startled him from his brooding. An elderly Comanche woman rode up on a paint pony, her silver hair braided beneath a worn shawl. Caleb recognized her immediately White Fawn, who had been midwife to his Sarah. In those last terrible hours. "You remember me," she said. Not a question, but a statement. Caleb helped her down from her horse. "Yes, ma'am, I remember." She studied his face with keen, dark eyes. "Your heart is troubled. I heard about the girl they took." Inside, she accepted a cup of coffee, holding it in weathered hands. "Tell me," she commanded. The whole story poured out of Caleb Mary Ellen's auction. His intervention, the brief weeks of protection he'd provided. And finally, the crushing defeat when they'd taken her away. White Fawn listened without interruption. When he finished, she reached into her shawl and withdrew a folded paper, yellow with age. "My grandfather was interpreter when the treaties were." "Signed," she said. "He kept copies of everything." She spread the document on the table. "Look here. The land where they built that poorhouse, it was never ceded. Still belongs to the people, by law and signature." Caleb leaned forward, hope flickering for the first time in days. "You mean the poorhouse sits on land they have no right to?" White Fawn confirmed. "They cannot legally hold anyone there." Caleb's hands trembled as he studied the treaty map, the carefully drawn boundaries, the official seals. This could free her, if you know how to use it right. White Fawn's eyes held a hint of steel. "My grandfather taught me. Sometimes the white man's paper is stronger than his guns." Caleb looked at the document with new reverence. Here was a way to help Mary Ellen that didn't require violence, a path of justice rather than vengeance. "I'll need help," he said slowly. "The preacher, maybe some of the churchwomen who showed her kindness. And you, if you're willing." White Fawn nodded, a slight smile touching her lips. "I will help. That girl deserves to birth her baby in dignity, not shame." For the first time since Mary Ellen had been taken, Caleb felt the weight on his chest ease slightly. He carefully refolded the precious document, hope kindling in his heart like a banked fire coming back to life. "Thank you," he said simply. White Fawn rose to leave. "Sarah would be proud of how you've acted," she said quietly. Protecting the innocent was always her way too. Caleb watched her ride away into the gathering dusk, the treaty paper secure in his shirt pocket. Its presence felt like a promise, a chance to fulfill his vow to Mary Ellen after all. The first rays of sunlight were just breaking over the eastern hills when Caleb saddled his horse. The treaty document lay carefully folded in his breast pocket, its presence giving him strength. Morning dew sparkled on the sage as he rode toward town, his mind clear and focused for the first time since Mary Ellen had been taken. Dry Creek was stirring to life when he arrived. The general store's windows still had their shutters drawn, but lamplight glowed from the church office where Reverend Matthews often worked on his sermons. Caleb tied his horse and knocked softly. "Come in," the preacher called Dot inside. The small office smelled of coffee and old books. Reverend Matthews sat at his desk, looking up from his Bible with raised eyebrows. "You're out early, brother. Got something you need to see." Caleb withdrew the treaty document with careful hands, spreading it on the desk. "White Fawn brought this to me last night." The preacher adjusted his spectacles, leaning forward to study the yellowed paper. His eyes widened as he read. "This is a territorial treaty map from 40 years ago. Look where they built the poorhouse," Caleb said quietly. "That land was never legally ceded. Still belongs to the Comanche, according to law." Reverend Matthews sat back, stroking his chin. "If this document is authentic, it could invalidate the writ against Mary Ellen." The county can't hold anyone in a building that's sitting on stolen land. Would Judge Harrison hear such a case? He's a fair man. Despite pressure from the railroad, but we'll need more than just this paper. The preacher stood. Come with me. They walked down the street to the county clerk's office. Tom Wilson, the clerk, was already at his desk despite the early hour. He was a thin, nervous man who had always seemed afraid of his own shadow, but he knew every legal document in the territory. Tom, Reverend Matthews said, "We need your expertise on something." Wilson adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as they showed him the treaty map. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the boundaries. This is genuine. I recognize the territorial governor's seal." He swallowed hard. "But going against the railroad boss, all we're asking is the truth." "Tom," Caleb said gently, "ain't right to hold an innocent girl on stolen ground." The clerk's shoulders straightened slightly. I can provide certified copies of the original poorhouse deed. Shows when and where they built it." He lowered his voice. "And I heard things when they rushed that writ through. It wasn't proper procedure at all." Hope rose in Caleb's chest. With the preacher's support and the clerk's evidence, they had a real chance. But he knew Hamilton, the railroad boss, wouldn't give up easily. The man had built his empire on buried secrets and broken laws. As evening approached, Caleb began making quiet visits around town. He started with Deputy Anderson, who had looked uncomfortable when they took Mary Ellen away. The deputy was chopping wood behind his house when Caleb approached. "Been weighing heavy on my mind," Anderson admitted, leaning on his axe. "That girl ain't done nothing to deserve the poorhouse. Railroad boss just wants to hide his son's shame." He spat in the dirt. "Count me in, Boone. I'll testify about how that writ came down. Not everyone was so courageous." The banker turned him away without a word. The feed store owner shook his head sadly, muttering about railroad contracts he couldn't afford to lose. But when Caleb visited the church ladies who had given Mary Ellen the baby booties, he found unexpected strength. That poor child, Mrs. Peterson declared, her white hair practically bristling with indignation. "I've seen what goes on in that poorhouse. Half rations for pregnant girls, working them until they can barely stand. It's not Christian, and it's not right." Her sister, Miss Sarah, nodded firmly. "We'll speak up, Mr. Boone. The railroad boss may own half the county, but he doesn't own our consciences." As darkness fell, Caleb returned to his cabin. He lit his lantern and spread paper on the kitchen table, drawing a deep breath. The words had to be just right. This wasn't about revenge or pride, was about justice, about protecting someone who couldn't protect herself hour after hour. He carefully wrote out his statement, describing how he had found Mary Ellen being sold like cattle, how he had offered her sanctuary, how the railroad boss had used his influence to tear her away. He detailed every fact, every witness, every piece of evidence that proved the poorhouse had no legal right to hold her. The lantern flame flickered as midnight passed, but Caleb kept writing. He thought of Mary Ellen's face when she had first laughed in his kitchen, how she had slowly begun to trust that not every man's hand would bring pain. He thought of his own Sarah, who had taught him that true strength lay in standing up for what was right, not in how hard you could hit. When he finally set down his pen, the statement was 10 pages long. Every word was measured, every claim supported. There was no anger in it, no threats, just the quiet power of truth laid bare. Caleb's hands, so massive they could bend horseshoes, were cramped from holding the pen, but his heart beat steady and strong. Tomorrow he would file his challenge with Judge Harrison. The railroad boss would fight dirty, but Caleb had something stronger than money or influence. He had justice on his side, and good people willing to stand with him. He carefully stacked the papers next to the treaty map, ready for morning. Outside his window, an owl called softly in the darkness. Caleb thought of Mary Ellen, alone in that grim poorhouse, and silently renewed his promise. He would bring her home, not with violence, but with law and faith and the strength of right dark. Clouds hung low over Dry Creek as dawn crept across the prairie. Caleb stood in his yard, adjusting the cinch on his saddle one final time. His Sunday suit felt stiff and confining after months of ranch wear, but today required proper courtroom attire. The treaty document rested securely in his breast pocket. Close to his heart, the clip-clop of hooves announced his visitors. White Fawn rode up on her paint pony, her gray hair neatly braided, wearing a clean calico dress that spoke of both her native heritage and her adaptation to frontier life. Behind her, Reverend Matthews approached in his buggy. "The spirits are restless today," White Fawn observed, glancing at the heavy sky. "But truth has power of its own." Caleb nodded, mounting his horse. The three of them made an unusual sight. As they rode toward town, the giant cowboy, the elderly Comanche woman, and the preacher in his black coat. But there was strength in their unity, a purpose that straightened their backs and lifted their chins. The courthouse square was already crowded when they arrived. Townsfolk clustered in whispers, stepping aside as Caleb dismounted. He helped White Fawn down from her pony with gentle respect. Deputy Anderson stood at the courthouse door, offering a quiet nod as they passed. Inside, the courtroom's wooden. Benches were filling quickly. The railroad boss, Jonathan Hamilton, sat near the front in an expensive Eastern suit, his lawyer beside him shuffling papers importantly. Hamilton's cold eyes followed Caleb's movement, his mouth twisted in a slight sneer. A door opened, and Mary Ellen was led in by the poorhouse matron. Caleb's heart clenched at the sight of her. She looked smaller somehow, her face pale and drawn, her pregnancy more pronounced against her thinned frame. But when she saw Caleb, color flooded her cheeks and her eyes filled with tears of relief. "Rise," the bailiff called out. The Honorable Judge Harrison presiding. The judge settled behind his bench, his weathered face impossible to read. "We're here today regarding the matter of Mary Ellen Thompson and her custody." He peered over his spectacles. "Mr. Preston, you represent the county's interests. T. Hamilton's." Lawyer stood, straightening his vest. "Yes, Your Honor. We seek to have the girl officially declared unfit and confined to the poorhouse until her confinement. She's clearly incapable of caring for herself or her coming child." "And who speaks?" "For Miss Thompson." Caleb rose to his full height. Several people gasped. They hadn't expected him to serve as her advocate. "I do, Your Honor, with Reverend Matthews' assistance." "Very well," the judge gestured. "Proceed with your arguments, Mr. Preston." The lawyer launched into a practiced speech about moral decay and public burden, painting Mary Ellen as a threat to decent society. Hamilton nodded along, his satisfaction evident. But when Preston finished, Caleb stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "before we discuss Mary Ellen's future, we need to address the present." He withdrew the treaty document carefully. "I have here proof that the poorhouse itself sits on land illegally taken from the Comanche people. Never properly ceded, never legally purchased." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Caleb handed the document to the judge. Harrison's eyebrows rose as he studied it. "I call White Fawn to speak to this matter," Caleb said. White Fawn walked to the front with dignity, her head high. Some people shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to seeing Indian women testify in court. But her voice was clear and strong. As she explained how her people had preserved the treaties, how the poorhouse land had been stolen through broken promises. "My father was among those who signed," she said, pointing to a mark on the yellowed page. "We did not give up that ground. The law you respect says it remains ours." Hamilton's lawyer jumped up. "This is absurd, Your Honor. Ancient Indian claims." have no bearing. The treaty carries the territorial governor's seal. Judge Harrison interrupted. It appears genuine. He turned to Reverend Matthews. You have something to add. The preacher stood, Bible in hand. Your Honor, Scripture tells us that justice must flow like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. When we allow the powerful to imprison the vulnerable on stolen ground, we mock both man's law and God's. Mary Ellen sat straighter as the preacher spoke, her hands protectively cradling her belly. Caleb could see hope beginning to shine in her eyes, but then Hamilton himself stood up, his face darkening. Let's be plain about what's at stake here, he announced. This railroad has brought prosperity to Dry Creek. We employ half the men. In this room, our planned expansion will bring hundreds more jobs. His voice hardened. But if this court starts entertaining spurious land claims and interfering with public order, we might need to reconsider our investments here. The threat hung heavy in the air. People began whispering anxiously. Caleb could see fear replacing resolve on many faces. The railroad's power over the town was real mortgages. Jobs, futures, all depended on Hamilton's goodwill. The tension in the courtroom crackled like heat lightning before a storm. Judge Harrison's expression remained unreadable as he studied the treaty document again, while Hamilton's confident smirk suggested he believed money would speak louder than justice. Mary Ellen's hands trembled in her lap, and Caleb longed to reassure her. But for now, all they could do was wait as the judge weighed law against power, truth against influence, right against might. White Fawn sat perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on the judge, generations of endured injustice evident in her steady gaze. Reverend Matthews gripped his Bible tightly, lips moving in silent prayer. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, wondering which way the scales would tip. Judge Harrison removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly with a handkerchief. The courtroom remained hushed, every eye fixed upon him. The weight of Hamilton's threat pressed down like a heavy wool blanket on a summer day. Caleb rose again, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. His voice trembled slightly, but grew stronger with each word. Your Honor, if I may speak one last time. The judge gestured for him to continue. I've watched this territory grow from wilderness, Caleb said, his deep voice carrying to every corner, seen how we measure progress by rails laid and fortunes made. But there's another measure that matters more: how we treat those who need protection. He turned, including the whole room in his gaze. No woman should be treated as property, bought and sold like cattle. No child should enter this world bearing the shame we put on their mother. Mary Ellen's hands tightened over her swollen belly as tears slid down her cheeks. That baby she carries, Caleb continued, is a life worth defending, a soul that deserves welcome, not scorn. The good book tells us to care for widows and orphans. Well, I reckon that includes girls cast aside by those meant to protect them. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, stood up suddenly. Your Honor, if I may? At the judge's nod, she smoothed her apron. I've seen Mary Ellen these past months at church. Seen how she helps the younger children with their Bible verses, despite folks treating her cruel. She's got a gentle heart. Another woman, Rose Sarah Miller, who ran the boarding house. She mended my quilts when my arthritis was acting up. Wouldn't take a penny for it neither. One by one, the older churchwomen stood, each offering a small testimony. They spoke of Mary Ellen's kindness, her willingness to help despite her condition, her quiet dignity in the face of mockery. Deputy Anderson cleared his throat from his position by the door. Your Honor, I got something to say too. He stepped forward, twisting his hat in his hands. I helped take her to that poor house. Ain't sat right with me since. She was wronged, sir, by folks more powerful than her, who ought to have done right by her instead. Hamilton's face had grown steadily redder as each person spoke. His lawyer leaned over, whispering urgently, "But—" The railroad boss waved him off. Judge Harrison sat in silence for long moments after the last speaker finished. The only sound was the tick of the courthouse clock and the rustle of paper as he reviewed the documents before him one final time. Finally, he looked up. "The law must serve justice, not power," he said slowly. "This court finds the writ concerning Mary Ellen Thompson void on 2 grounds. First, the poorhouse's claim to custodial authority is dismissed, as its very location appears legally questionable." He held up the treaty document. "Second, and more importantly, no evidence has been presented that Miss Thompson is unfit or incapable. Rather, this community has testified to her character and worth." Mary Ellen pressed her hands to her mouth, hardly daring to breathe. "The writ is hereby dismissed. Miss Thompson is free to choose her own path forward." The judge's gavel cracked. Against the wooden block with finality, Hamilton surged to his feet, face mottled with rage. "You'll regret this," he snarled. "All of you." He stormed toward the door, his lawyer scurrying behind him. But no one was watching him leave. All eyes were on Mary Ellen as she burst into tears, rising awkwardly from her seat. Caleb crossed to her in 2 long strides, and she threw herself into his arms, sobbing with relief. The churchwomen crowded around them, offering handkerchiefs and quiet blessings. White Fawn approached slowly, placing a weathered hand on Mary Ellen's shoulder. "You are strong," she said simply. "Like the young oak that bends in the storm but does not break." Reverend Matthews raised his hands. "Let us thank the Lord for justice done this day." The townspeople who had gathered to watch the spectacle stood in respectful silence, many bowing their heads. Some who had jeered at Mary Ellen months ago now looked ashamed, avoiding her eyes. Others smiled tentatively, as if seeing her truly. For the first time, through it all, Caleb held Mary Ellen steady. His massive frame a shelter she could finally trust wouldn't be torn away. Her tears gradually slowed, and she lifted her face, red-eyed but smiling. "Can we go home now?" she whispered. Caleb nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Yes, little sister. Let's go home." The gathered crowd parted as Caleb led Mary Ellen toward the courthouse door, the preacher and White Fawn following close behind. Sunlight had broken through the clouds, streaming through the windows and warming the wooden floors. Outside, the spring wind had swept the sky clear, promising fair weather ahead. The wagon wheels creaked softly as Caleb guided the horses home along the familiar trail. Mary Ellen sat beside him, wrapped in a wool blanket against the evening chill. Her eyes were still red from crying, but a peaceful glow had settled over her features. The setting sun painted the Colorado mountains in shades of purple and gold, while spring winds rustled through the sage. "Careful now," Caleb said, helping her down from the wagon with gentle hands. Her swollen belly made movement awkward, but she managed with his steady support. Watch that last step. Before they could reach the cabin door, the sound of approaching wagons made them turn. A small procession of church ladies was making its way up the ranch road, led by Mrs. Peterson in her husband's buckboard. "Now, don't you two worry about a thing," Mrs. Peterson called out as she pulled up. "We've got everything sorted." The women descended like a flock of determined birds, arms laden with baskets and bundles. Mrs. Miller carried a stack of fresh-sewn quilts. Behind her, young Sally Jenkins balanced a covered dish that smelled of apple pie. Even shy Mrs. Wright had come, clutching a bundle of dried herbs and teas for the baby when its time comes. "You've done enough already," Mary Ellen protested, weakly, overwhelmed by their kindness. "Nonsense," Mrs. Peterson declared, sweeping past her into the cabin. "After what you've been through? This is what neighbors do." The women transformed the cabin's interior within minutes. Fresh quilts appeared on Mary Ellen's bed. The kitchen table groaned under dishes of fried chicken, cornbread, and preserves. Someone had even brought a rocking chair, well-worn but sturdy. For when the little one comes, Mrs. Miller explained, patting Mary Ellen's shoulder. Caleb stood back, watching with quiet amazement as his bachelor home was softened by feminine touches. A bouquet of wildflowers appeared in a jar. Curtains materialized for the windows. The women moved with practiced efficiency. Years of barn raisings and quilting bees having taught them the power of many hands working together. Mr. Boone, Mrs. Peterson pulled him aside. We've arranged a schedule. One of us will come by every few days to help out, especially as her time grows near. Her expression brooked no argument. A girl needs womenfolk around her at such times. Obliged, ma'am, Caleb said humbly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the women began gathering their things to leave. Each hugged Mary Ellen, whispering words of encouragement. Mrs. Peterson was the last to go, pressing a small Bible into Mary Ellen's hands. For strength, she said simply, when the last wagon had disappeared down the trail, leaving them in growing. Darkness, Caleb lit the lamps and stoked up the fire. Mary Ellen sank into the rocking chair with a weary sigh, one hand resting on her belly. Reckon I ought to fix us some supper, Caleb said, though the women had left enough food for days. I can help, Mary Ellen offered, starting to rise. You just rest there, he insisted gently. Been a long day. He set about preparing a simple stew, adding vegetables and meat to the pot with practiced motions. The familiar routine felt different somehow, warmer, with Mary Ellen's presence by the fire. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. As the stew simmered, filling the air with savory smells, Mary Ellen's soft voice broke the comfortable silence. I never thought God cared much about folks like me, she admitted, staring into the flames. Seemed he only listened to important people, respectable ones. She touched the small Bible in her lap. But today, seeing all those people stand up. For me, her voice caught. Maybe he was watching out for me all along, leading me here. Caleb stirred the stew thoughtfully. Reckon he was leading us both, he said finally. After Sarah died, my wife, I was angry at God. Couldn't see the purpose in such pain. He glanced at Mary Ellen. But watching you these past months, seeing your courage, it rekindled something in me. Reminded me that faith ain't about having all the answers. It's about trusting even when the trail seems dark. Mary Ellen nodded, tears gleaming in the firelight. Do you think, she hesitated, do you think he'll watch over my baby too? I know he will, Caleb said firmly. He ladled stew into 2 bowls and brought them to the fire, and so will we. Setting. The bowls aside for a moment, Caleb bowed his head. Mary Ellen reached out hesitantly and took his weathered hand in her smaller one. Lord Caleb's deep voice filled the cabin. We thank you for your guidance and protection, for bringing light out of darkness and hope where there was fear. Thank you for the kindness of neighbors, for justice done, and for leading this child to safe harbor. Watch over her and the little one she carries, and help us both to trust in your plan, even when we can't see the way clear. Amen. Amen, Mary. Ellen whispered Dot outside. The spring wind howled around the cabin's sturdy walls, rattling the new curtains. But inside, lamplight gleamed on the fresh quilts and flowers. The fire crackled warmly, and the smell of stew mingled with the lingering scent of apple pie. Mary Ellen rocked gently in her chair, one hand still clasped in Caleb's, while he sat on the hearth beside her. In that moment of shared peace, both felt the truth of the psalm. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. The weeks flowed into months as winter settled over the Colorado highlands. Snow blanketed the mountain peaks, transforming Caleb's ranch into a white sanctuary. Inside the cabin, Mary Ellen's belly grew larger as the women of Dry Creek took turns visiting, teaching her the skills she would need for motherhood. Mrs. Peterson showed her how to fold tiny garments and swaddle a flour sack for practice. Mrs. Miller taught her old lullabies, while Sally Jenkins demonstrated how to test bathwater on her wrist. Through it all, Caleb kept the fire burning fierce and steady, hauling in endless armloads of split pine to ward off the mountain cold. On a night when the wind howled like 1,000 wolves, Mary Ellen's labor pains began. White Fawn arrived. Through the storm, her braids crusted with ice, she shooed Caleb from the bedroom with firm kindness. Hour after hour, he paced the floorboards, wincing at each cry of pain. His prayers grew desperate as the storm raged outside. Then, piercing through the wind came a new sound, the sharp, healthy wail of a newborn. Caleb's hands shook as White Fawn beckoned him inside. There lay Mary Ellen, exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the church ladies' quilts. A son, White Fawn announced softly. Caleb lifted the squalling infant with trembling fingers, tears streaming freely down his weathered cheeks. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered hoarsely. "Thank you. You've given us a home," Mary Ellen murmured. Watching them through tired eyes, spring crept into the highlands like a gentle awakening. The snow retreated, revealing tender green shoots pushing through dark soil. Caleb's once quiet cabin now rang with new sounds. The infectious giggle of the baby boy and Mary Ellen's sweet humming as she went about her daily tasks. One crisp Sunday morning, Caleb hitched up the wagon. Mary Ellen settled in beside him, the baby bundled warm against her chest as they rolled into Dry Creek. The change in the townsfolk was clear as mountain water. Mrs. Peterson waved warmly from her porch. The general store owner tipped his hat, looking somewhat ashamed of his past coldness. Even the ranch hands who had once sneered now offered awkward congratulations. Inside the white-painted church, sunlight streamed through windows as the preacher held the baby high. "This child," he declared, "reminds us that the Lord's mercy makes all things new." The congregation nodded, many wiping away tears. That evening, Caleb sat in his old rocker, cradling the sleeping infant in the soft lamplight. "Never thought I'd have family again," he admitted quietly, his voice rough with emotion. After losing Sarah, Mary Ellen touched his arm gently. "Could I stay?" she asked. "Not because you bought me, but because we're family now." Caleb could only nod, his heart too full for words. Outside, purple dusk settled over the mountains, while the cabin glowed like a beacon of hope, sheltering 3 souls bound together by love and second chances. Thanks for watching. Stories like this shape us in ways we don't always expect. If something resonated, subscribe. I'm back tomorrow with another one worth hearing.